It's May 9th, 2026. Welcome to YesToHellWith.com. Over the past several weeks, we have discussed the structure of prosecution in America. We have discussed plea bargaining, prosecutorial immunity, withholding of evidence, pressure inside the courtroom, and why most people lose long before the trial ever begins. But now we move from theory into example, a real example. An example involving a man named Orlando Carter, a man who was convicted in federal court and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Now, before we go further, understand something important. This series is not merely about a conviction. This series is about what happened before the conviction, because unlike many criminal cases that quietly disappear into history, this case is still ongoing, almost 20 years later. Years, decades after conviction, years after imprisonment, years after release. The fight continues. And that raises an important question. Why? Why would a man continue searching for records, agencies, filings, banking documents, OCC correspondence, and federal contradictions years after leaving prison? Most people do not continue fighting for decades unless they believe something fundamental was wrong from the very beginning. And according to the Carter materials, that is exactly the issue. A man who is innocent doesn't stop fighting, ever. Now understand carefully, this series is not about asking you to react emotionally. This series is not about asking you to hate prosecutors. This series is not asking you to blindly distrust institutions. This series is asking a much more dangerous question. What happens if the foundation of a federal prosecution was never independently verified in the manner that the public assumes and expects? Now think carefully about that. Most Americans assume the FBI independently verified the records. Prosecutors independently authenticated the financial structure. Federal agencies reconciled contradictions. Banks supplied accurate information. And obligations underlying the prosecution actually existed in the manner presented to the jury. But according to the Carter materials, serious questions emerged years later concerning whether the very obligation at the center of the prosecution ever existed in the manner represented during trial. And since I believe it's true, then everything downstream becomes unstable. I think you'll conclude this as well. Now, over the coming weeks, we are going to examine the issue of the $4 million loan obligation, the FBI investigation, the courtroom narrative, the OCC findings, the role of prosecutors Gregory Lockhart and Richard Chema, and eventually the conduct of later United States attorneys Benjamin Glassman and Kenneth Parker. Because according to the Carter materials, these later prosecutors, Glassman and Parker, encountered contradictory evidence years after conviction and yet preserved the prosecution narrative rather than independently re-examining the structure beneath it. Now understand something very important. The issue we are examining is not merely whether mistakes occurred. The issue is whether assumptions hardened into official truth before the foundational structure was independently verified. That distinction changes everything, because once assumptions become indictments, courtroom narratives, convictions, appeals, and official records, future institutions often begin protecting the record itself rather than revisiting the original presumptions beneath it. And according to the Carter materials, that is exactly what happened here. Now, over this series, you're going to hear repeated references to presumption, burden of proof, institutional prestige, prosecutorial duty, OCC findings, contradictory federal positions, and what eventually becomes one of the most explosive allegations in the entire series. that later U.S. attorneys encountered evidence undermining the prosecutorial foundation and preserved the conviction anyways. But before we arrive there, we must begin where every prosecution begins, the allegation itself. Because according to the Carter materials, if the allegation collapses, then much of the prosecutorial structure collapses with it. So the next episode, the $4 million loan. And as always, may truth reign supreme.